I live in a small, tight-knit rural community in the Scottish Highland Territories. Obviously, I won't disclose exactly where, but all you need to understand is just how out of the way we are. Miles and miles of roads winding around endless hills. Burns and locks separate us from the nearest town where any brand name stores operate. My mom and dad are farmers, but in a more rustic sense. Think subsistence farming, with a little bit of good faith selling and trading with the nearest neighbors. In the north of Scotland, cell phone and internet coverage is unreliable at best anywhere outside your own home. My auntie and uncle visit every now and then from Glasgow, and if I want anything, I can have it sent up here. We're not all that disconnected with modern-day technology and postage. But anyway, I only told you that to give you a little bit of context towards my situation, a feel for where we are. We have some sheep and chickens, but mostly our pride and joy has been our cows. We keep them happily, and they've plenty of space to roam and have good lives. We genuinely care about them. My dad especially. Even after 50 years of heading the farm, he still hates having to slaughter any of them. Big softy he is. Something most people don't know about cows is they tend to stay in barns during the day if they have the chance and then head out to pasture at night. One evening about 2 weeks ago, we were at the table for a late dinner when we heard one of the cows crying out, louder above the usual bustle. When a cow is in pain or especially scared, it cries out in this weird whining scream, especially high-pitched. Me and my dad gave each other a look and grabbed our torches and ran out into the field with our collie, Kira, to try and see what it was. When we reached them, the beams of the old flashlights swept across the scattered herd, most of them still moving and giving these scared moves. No matter how long you work on a farm, it's always unnerving being out there at night. All those big animals with their eyes reflecting with that ghostly green glow. Quickly, I spotted one amongst the herd, Nell, with a damp, red glistening wound on the neck. Me and my dad spent a little time getting close to her, but it took a while because she was understandably skittish. Finally, getting a close look, I felt my heart drop and my stomach churn when we saw it. A bite. A big one. Now, another thing you need to know about Scottish cows is they don't have any natural predators. Foxes are too small and the wolves and bears died off decades ago, so nothing could have or should have done this. We heard Kira growling, and turning the flashlight to her, we saw her low to the ground, baring her teeth, face pointing towards the far corner of the field. We turned our beams and stood there still as stone was one of the cows. It was eerie seeing it just standing there, unmoving and staring back at us. Caught in the light, it wasn't hard to see that its lips and chin were wet with blood. My dad looked at it with his mouth partially open and eyes narrowed, placing a hand on my shoulder and stepping in front of me. It was Clarabelle, one of the larger of the herd who was just a couple months into her pregnancy. We'd never had any aggression in our animals before, just the odd nip and shove. "She must be sick," muttered my dad before adding, "Take Kira inside." The words came through to me, but I felt frozen as still as that cow. She was looking dead at me, those reflective eyes a sheer pale green that bored into my soul and sent chills down my spine as I watched a single red bead of blood trickle down her lips. My dad shook me softly, repeating himself a little more firmly, which woke me from my stupor. Nodding, I tore myself away from the cow's stare and pulled the disgruntled collie and back up to the house. It was only on the return trip that I realized how hard my heart was racing, thumping away in my chest. Something about the whole situation just felt off, and I hated leaving my dad alone back there. I told my mom what happened and explained everything, leaving her as confused as me and my dad. Thankfully, it wasn't long before he came back in, announcing he'd gotten her back and locked her and the bitten one Nell in separate pens in the barn, away from the others. He'd call a vet and see if we could get the herd checked in case there was some kind of disease going about. Needless to say, I did not sleep easy that night. Laid in bed, all I could think of was the look in his eyes, the intensity and the intent I could feel behind it. I love animals and I don't scare easy, but this felt different, felt wrong. After a good few hours of tossing and turning, struggling to keep the cows off my mind, sleep finally took me. I woke with a start to the sound of my dad shouting from downstairs. Frantically, I rolled out of bed and shoved on some clothes, stumbling down the steps with a nervous lump in my throat for what could have happened now. It was early, a cold amber tinting the highlands from the sunrise peeking through the cloudy gray sky. The front door was lying open, so I hurried outside and spotted the herd standing in the middle of the field looking towards the farmhouse, all making distressed mooing sounds. I saw my mom in front of the open barn doors, covering her mouth with her hands, a look of shock in her eyes. Nervously, I stepped forward till I laid eyes on it too. The sight made my gut rise, my hand coming to grip onto the barn door to support my legs, which I felt like they were about to give out from under me as I tried not to vomit. On the left side of the barn, the wooden stall separating Clarabelle from the cow she'd bitten had been smashed through, the wood splintered and broken. In the pen, Clarabelle was stood over the mess that was Nell, mouth full of bloody meat. The dead animal's throat was torn open, her blood spattered across the wall and hay-covered floor from where it had been ripped open. It wasn't just that, though. Her stomachs were eaten into as well, a gaping hole where her gut was still warm and strewn with gore, and before I turned away, I was fairly sure I saw the partway eaten body of a fetal calf amongst it. The way she'd been moving to take each bite and swallow it was unnervingly quick and erratic, nothing like a cow's usual lazy motions. I couldn't stomach another look. The sound of meat being torn and chewed by blunt teeth, the offensive, coppery smell of the blood filling my senses as I struggled not to hyperventilate. It was then that I heard my dad yelling, having grabbed a pitchfork and begun trying to force Clarabelle back from the body, and it took him physically prodding her to even get her to step back. Speaking loudly, he told my mom to call our neighbor Horace to come round and bring his rifle. She ran back to the scene in a hurry, but I was still frozen as I watched my dad shout and fend back the bloodied animal. Clarabelle swallowed with a gross gulping noise, and soon as she had nothing left to chew on, she moved forwards towards the corpse again. "Hey," my dad yelled at her, thrusting forward the pronged pitchfork in an effort to scare the cow back, but she completely ignored him. She was strong, the strength behind her movements knocking the makeshift weapon out of my father's hands as she forced her way back to the corpse of Nell. When she finally reached it, she immediately bit down again into the pile of the dead cow's stomach, but when she opened her mouth, it was wider than I'd ever seen a cow's mouth open before. Clarabelle made this horrid noise, like someone with a hoarse breath breathing inwards. My dad took a few slow steps back, watching in horror as the terrible feeding continued. I was still stood in the doorway to the barn while this was happening, and glancing back to the house, I could see my frantic-looking mom looking out the window at us from the kitchen on the phone, talking to someone who I guessed must have been Horace. I heard my dad mutter something, drawing my attention back towards the broken stalls. What in God's name? He'd gone pale, a look of confused disgust and fear on his face. Instinctually, I looked to follow his gaze and saw it too. I felt the breath leave my shaking body, limbs and chest going cold. I'd mentioned before that Clarabelle was pregnant, but we could see her belly distending. It was moving, shifting as something was pressing against it from the inside, her abdomen becoming visibly larger and the skin thinner as she fed. But the thing pressing against her from the inside, it didn't at all look like a calf. It looked like an arm, a hand pushing outwards for a moment. I took a few faltering steps back, but my dad turned to me and began storming away from the scene, moving past me and marching towards the storage shed. When he re-emerged, he was carrying a jerry can of petrol, and the look on his face was terrifying. It was this God-fearing anger, like he was hellishly intent on righting what we could both see was so wrong. He walked right past me into the barn and immediately began splashing it on Clarabelle on the stalls. The sound of her still horrid breathing, crunching and swallowing still permeating the chamber, the thing in her stomach still growing and convulsing. The smell of petrol and blood mixed potently as my dad emptied the can out into a trail which led past where I'd stood away a few feet from the barn. He closed the doors and pulled the latch, locking it before lighting a match. He hesitated for just a second, looking at me as if to check what was happening was even real. All I could give him in return was a pale-faced, pleading expression. He dropped the match, which lit an instant tall flame, following the trail of gasoline quickly with a dull crackling roar, right up to and under the slight gap beneath the barn doors. It was full of hay and dry wood in there. We both knew that soon enough it would be engulfed, along with whatever it was that was inside. I stepped back as it intensified, feeling the heat coming off it and watching the smoke billowing upwards. I could feel this tension in my chest, like I was waiting for something to happen, but even as I smelled burning meat, the pained bovine cries I expected never came. As I was about to let out the breath I had been holding, a sudden ungodly shriek started. I ran away as the sound burst forth from the flaming barn as my dad stood firm outside the barn doors. I ran as I heard the horribly pained mix of animal and human wailing from inside the inferno. I couldn't take any more. I ran inside the house, straight to the bathroom, dropped in front of the toilet, and was sick. It was hours before the fire burned out. There was nothing left at the barn but charred wood and ash and the bones of the cows. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel safe out here again, though, because my dad told me something that I'll never forget for as long as I live. He saw something escape the fire.